Neat, excellent. So my name is Daniel. I have been debating for a very long time. I really love debating, and it's awesome to see lots of people here who also like debating. We are doing a workshop today, particularly on facts and how facts operate in debate and assertions of fact, but it kind of bleeds over into a broader discussion, both of rebuttal and of what really debating should look like and some of the underpinning principles and theories behind how debating operates, that when you actually think them through, give you, I think, a little bit more of a background of how to think about debating in a way that can make you an effective debater and an effective judge. Full disclosure, I'm coming off the tail end of having COVID, so my throat is potentially a little bit scratchy, and I may need to take breaks to drink some water. If you have any questions throughout the seminar, feel free to flick me a private message on Zoom. I should be at the top with a little underscore and then Daniel Maier Grant, which is my name. And we will dive into the seminar very shortly. Before that, just some brief notes about who I am. As I said, I've been debating for a long time. I've graduated university now. I work as a lawyer in Auckland, New Zealand. I made the semi-final of Korea Worlds, which is the most recent Worlds that took part. I'm a top 10 Austral speaker, and I've done lots of judging things, particularly in Asia. I really love judging in Asia, and I think it's really excellent to see these types of development institutions that essentially build our capacity as a broader Australasian circuit. A circuit which is very near and dear to me, which I'm heavily committed to, but I think has an approach to debating that really, for me, matches what I think debating should look like. So every single person in this call, don't just think about your own careers. Think about debating as an activity that has legitimacy, that has a culture that goes beyond just you, but it's something to which you contribute, and you need to work very hard to make sure it stays strong and stays healthy. Neat. So I will share the presentation, and then we will dive into it. Neat. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Perfect. So as I said, what we're looking at today is Deep Rebuttal, how to untangle good lies. And just a brief thank you at the beginning. Firstly, to Debating 404, who obviously set up this Zoom call, and to the University of Auckland Debating Society, my debating society, who taught me everything I know about lying. Who lie to me constantly. I love them deeply as an institution. But there is, and I just want to note at the outset, something quite beautiful about debating, in that it relies a lot on trust, not just a trust that you get given unconditionally between people. Oh, I trust you, I trust yourself, but trust that we actively try and manufacture when we're debating, trying to persuade people to believe in us, to put their faith in the things that we are saying. And this is something that is both much more subtle and a lot more blatant than I think people give it credit for. Because in many ways, when we think about the way that trust operates in debating, it's very hard to explain and it's very hard to think about. And that just means that sometimes we kind of ignore it. We try and reduce debating into something that is entirely sterile. It's really just like measuring scores that ping between teams in an entirely technical exercise of, or like a match of intellects. But that's not what debating is, right? Debating is not a complex essay writing competition where evidence is thoroughly checked and arguments follow highly formulaic outlays. Debating is something that is fluid, that often relies on much more subjectivity and on the ability to communicate from one human being to another human being. It's not about communicating in an idealized sense. It's about communicating in a very human sense. And part of that communication is making assertions about fact. This thing is true. You should believe me that this thing is true. And a lot of debating's beauty actually comes from that, because when we are engaging in the human component of debating, we're doing something that has been done for thousands and thousands of years in trying to generate credibility and convince people of your position. And that's where like the poetry and art from debating comes from. But it is also one of the areas in which our biases creep in which our human frailties and inability to follow things appropriately and parse information makes for arbitrary results or biased results and things that are bad. And I think the way that we can best deal with this aspect of debating, which is probably its hardest bit of debating to deal with, that subjectivity, is to be as open as possible about it, not to erase it from the aspect of debating, but to take part in active conversations that allow us to have a more thorough community-wide understanding of what it means, and hopefully keep some of that magic while tamping down on the way it can act in arbitrary ways. Regardless, I think it's almost impossible to remove, and the people who try and remove subjectivity from debating often just end up constructing certain types of norms that favor one group or another, and debating should never be fully set in a particular way of doing things. It should be constantly evolving as new generations rise up. In fact, the generation of most people watching here will formulate debating in a way that breaks the types of norms, biases, and commitments that I have. Nonetheless, I'm very good at debating, and I hope you think about the things that I say as something that you can hopefully learn from. But note, the things that I'm saying can be challenged just as much, and that in many ways I rely on some of the tricks in explaining them that you will hopefully learn about in this presentation. Neat. So the first question you need to ask yourself when you think about rebutting factual assertions, that building block of debating, this thing is true from which everything else in a debate follows, is to ask yourself, well, what is a good lie? If something is untrue, what about the way in which it is said or the way in which it is constructed makes it potentially effective within a debate? And I'm going to give you a story, and this is like debating lore from when I was a first year in 2015. Learning about debating as it took place in New Zealand, there was one very specific lie that has reached like mythological status in New Zealand debating. We used to have a style, it's still called Joynt scroll, but the style has slightly changed, in which you'd have a month to prepare the topics. So these were 10-minute speeches, really dense debates about incredibly heavy issues. And one of the debates was about Iran, which in 2015 was really like a hot ticket issue, and the way in which the global community should respond to it. And one of the major points that was run in the debates was what are the effects of sanctions? What effect does it have on oil production within Iran, and how might that play out? One of the teams in this semi-final openly stood up and claimed that China was building a pipeline that could pipe oil from Iran all the way to China, and that this eviscerated the claims that had been made by the affirming team about the effects of sanctions. And 7 judges sat there going, I really don't know if that's true. And they have no way to tell whether that's true, right? Like, we just have no idea to tell whether China is building a pipeline between Iran and China. And as you can see, it's actually quite far when you look at it on a map between Iran and China. And that negating team ended up winning the debate, and afterwards revealing that they had no idea whether China was building a pipeline either. They just kind of come up with that on the spur of the moment, and really hoped that it would be believed within that debate. But they didn't lie outright. They made an educated guess about the way that geopolitics operated, and they tried to bed it in certain assumptions that the adjudicators would have about the way the world works, such to build it to a position that it was credible in the debate and was able to help them tide over the debate. Because often what we're doing in debates when you have 15 minutes of prep is not making statements that we 100% know are correct. We're making a long series of educated guesses, telling narratives, building stories that hopefully that line up close enough with the truth to convince judges to give us this debate. But when you are thinking about a claim like that, it does not end at the assertion of the fact. It does not end, this thing is true, this thing is not true. And when you move beyond just the assertion, counter-assertion framework for thinking about facts within the debates, it actually reveals that there's this whole substrata of techniques that are used by debaters to convince you of this thing is fact, you should believe me, and that therefore the points that I make should flow from that. So how do factual assertions work? Let's start to just unpack this idea. The central principle behind how a judge ideally should be judging a debate is they ask themselves, would the informed global citizen, and you will read so many things about the informed global citizen, read the Australs handbook, read the World's Manual about what this concept means. Would the informed global citizen believe this is true in the context of the debate? Those are the 4 or 5 words that are probably the least discussed in terms of why we should believe something, when it in fact encompasses an incredible range of different things that can be weaponized weaponized by debaters. I would encourage you to learn, understand the informed global citizen, stuff like what they are reasonably assumed to know, and how their knowledge plays out in different contexts, how to deal with speculative ideas, those types of things, because you can actually glean a lot from reading something like the Australs manual. But when you look at the context of the debate, it goes far beyond whether the informed global citizen would believe this if they hear this in isolation. It actually speaks to debate craft and the way in which people present facts in context that makes them believable or unbelievable. And I just give a couple of examples below. The most basic believable fact is that the sky is generally blue during the day. Like, that's something that does not need any cushioning around it to believe it, right? The informed global citizen will likely believe that, even if it is presented with absolutely no supporting statements, no tricks, no rhetoric, no nothing. That's just something they can accept. I would actually encourage you to think of the informed global citizen as being a little bit smarter than that, though. Like, they actually know quite a bit more than merely that the sky is generally blue, something they can observe with their own eyes. Another fact that I would probably, as a judge, accept with almost no other supporting information, this is something the average reasonable voter knows, is Russia sells Europe a lot of natural gas. Why? Because the informed global citizen is familiar with headlines, they're familiar with what goes on in the world generally, and the fact that Russia sells Europe a lot of natural gas is something that is discussed incredibly widely, incredibly across all different ideological, and in fact, probably all in every single international newspaper, no matter what context you're in. Something like that will have probably passed across a headline. It's also a very uncontroversial statement. It's something that most people in the world agree on, and it's something that doesn't therefore need a lot more elaboration. This can essentially operate then as a base fact, something that sits within the debate and that more facts can be built off of. And I give at the end here an example of a more complex assertion. And a complex assertion is something like Nord Stream 2, which is an oil pipeline project, was projected to carry more than half of Russia's gas exports. Without it, the Russian economy collapses. I would need a little bit more than just a team standing up and telling me that for me to believe that statement. And in fact, I don't know if this is true. This is something I thought up. It could be true. It could not be true. But the way in which teams would try and convince me of that fact is subject to a lot of trickery and art, depending how you want to look at it. But the one last thing I'll draw your attention to here is that assertions are always connected to value judgments. So work out the relationships. Why is a team making this claim? They're obviously making this claim because they have some contingent value. Either Russia is changing its behavior, or lots of people get hurt from this behavior, that is predicated on the Russian economy collapsing. And the Russian economy collapsing, in this particular example, is in and of itself Nord Stream 2, predicated on Nord Stream 2 carrying a lot of Russia's natural gas exports. So what you have there is just like a chain of assertions that are all like a little bit speculative, but together operate to reach a value judgment that can be weighed by the judge within a debate. And so those are more and more complex assertions that would need some analysis as to how they play out. So what are the things that people do to help convince the judge that their factual assertions are true and another factual assertion is untrue? And I've just given you essentially quite like a thorough list of things that people will be thinking about, good debaters will be thinking about when they're trying to convince a judge of a fact that's kind of 50-50. I have no idea how much of Russia's natural gas relies on Gazprom, on Nord Stream 2. But I'm going to try and convince the judge my hardest if I have points that are contingent on that fact, if I have a value judgment that requires me to prove this factual assertion. So first thing that you always look for, and judges will be looking for this too, when you make a factual assertion, is lack of a counter narrative. So if I tell you something and no one disagrees with it in the debate, that doesn't 100% mean it's true. Sorry, someone's unmuted. No worries. I'll ask the. Oh no. Okay, perfect. I don't. Sorry, the judge won't be 100% credible if you present someone and no one disagrees with it. If I tell you the sky is generally orange during the day, even if no one disagrees with it, as a judge, I'm probably not going to believe it. And I'm probably not going to give any credit to points that flow off it, because it's something that quite obviously is stuff that the informed global citizen would know and be able to discard without any responses. And this is maybe something a couple judges get wrong. They get too anti-interventionist. They're like, I'm never going to use my own knowledge. But really what you're just using there is the most basic knowledge that someone who's an informed global citizen understands about the way that the world operates and can use it to dismiss it. Nonetheless, the lack of a counter narrative is something that really bolsters a point, because there's no other way the world could be that is presented by you. And that can be as much as not having any like blunt denial. So no one being like, I disagree with you, and it becoming in contention in the debate, all the way to there being a complex alternative truth that the judge is weighing. So if there is a strong alternative truth, this is the way the world looks, it doesn't look like this, it's much easier for the judge to be like, well, yeah, okay, I see the flaws as to why that operates. I don't trust this argument in the way it has been run. So the lack of a counter narrative is one thing that allows people to get away with a lot in the realm of factual assertions. The second layer is a solid factual matrix. And this is a complex phrase for something that is actually very simple. When you are making a complicated factual claim, what you are doing is you are building off the fact that the judge knows certain things. And if you bring the judge's attention to the fact that they know certain things, that other thing becomes more likely or more plausible. And what happens then is people build, using the judge's prior beliefs, from a set of like basic, understandable factual assertions that the judge is very willing to accept, to a more complex 50-50 one that may be contested, but they can nonetheless convince the judge of. And I'll give you just one example. Say as a judge, as a team, I'm trying to make the claim that the Taiwanese semiconductor industry is heavily reliant on only two companies. Once again, I don't really know if this is true, like factually. This is going well beyond my personal knowledge about what is true, and probably beyond what the judge knows as well. So if I have an entire argument all premised on the fact that there are only these two companies, and that's really important for some reason, I'm going to want to do a little bit more to explain why the judge should believe me that there are only two facts. So what are some facts that the average reasonable judge might find more believable than just the blatant assumption that there are two facts? Well, I can tell the judge that it's really, really hard to make semiconductors. That's like a fact that's actually like much more easily provable. Like it's something that underpins almost all technology. There's very high rates of innovation and turnover. You need highly specialized knowledge, which means that it's very hard to do it. And the second claim that I can make is it's really capital intensive to have a factory. And what I mean by that is you need really large machines to run these types of semiconductor facilities, which means you need a lot of money in order to set up a factory in order to do this. I then can take these two facts. It's really hard to do it, and it's really expensive to do it when you're setting it up, to bolster the claim that there are only two companies. Because I'll say in industries in which it's really hard to do something and there's really high startup costs, you tend to consolidate into only a couple of companies, which means that from what you know about semiconductors and the semiconductor industry, you can then believe my factual assertion that there are only two companies, or there are very few companies that operate within the semiconductor industry. So what I've just done for you there is a very basic example of a factual matrix, where I've given you some like understandable facts, the judge is quite willing to agree with. And it's not like the opposition is going to stand up and be like, oh no, semiconductor industries, it's really cheap to set up a semiconductor factory, or it's not that hard to make semiconductors. It's quite hard to disagree with that like claim. And it's much easier to just deny that there are two companies. So if I give the bedrock of those facts and say, well, it's really unlikely that there's lots of them, it makes it more likely that the judge is going to believe the subsequent claim that I make. The second important thing that you need to recognize about factual matrices is they need to be consistent, and not just consistent within a particular point, consistent across the debate. Because if I bring to the judge's attention an example that is inconsistent from your own case that you agree with that end conclusion, that makes it less likely that the judge is going to buy it. So say, for example, I've explained why there's a huge amount of competition internally within the semiconductor industry. And then my next point is, well, there's only two companies. I will stand up and say, well, they've made the claim that there's a lot of competition, but they've also made the claim that there's only two companies. So it's really unlikely in the context where there's lots of competition that there are only two companies, and vice versa. We think that there is a lot of competition, which means that there has got to be more than two companies. So once again, that's leveraging off the factual matrix, the inconsistency within the factual matrix, to call into doubt the factual assertion that underpins beliefs. So counter narratives and a solid factual matrix are probably the two bedrock principles behind how factual assertions work. But there are a number of other things that teams use to bolster it. And this again comes back to that basic point that I elucidated in the introduction, which is that debating is much more than just the weighing of ideas. It's about human communication, and the way that humans process arguments and process ideas is much more than just the logical consistency or logical flow or logical probabilities of those different types. So here are some of the things that they do. The first thing to say is they have the right level of specificity. And what I mean by that is that sometimes you can be precise in a way that loses accuracy. And what I mean by that is you can be very specific in a way that doesn't actually bolster the idea that what you're saying is true. Or you can be too vague or too unwilling to commit, which makes the judge question whether or not you actually know what you are talking about. And I'll give you an example. In the previous slide, I used the sorry, I actually don't know how to go backwards. Here we go. Nord Stream 2 was projected to carry more than half of Russia's gas exports. That statement has a certain level of specificity, doesn't? Because I'm not saying Nord Stream 2 was projected to carry 48% or 53%, which is the type of like specificity that really doesn't engender much confidence, right? Because it just sounds so palpably made up. No one has that fact just floating in their head. And if they did, they probably Googled it, which is the type of thing that will decrease their credibility to me as a judge. But more than half, it just has that like perfect level of vagueness and lack of specificity. That's like, yeah, that's something someone could know. That's something that someone could reasonably understand the way that it operates. And you're going to want to try and pick the right level of specificity as to how those types of points operate. Then there's something called knowledge signaling, which is similar to specificity, but doesn't actually go to the claim itself. It goes to the types of language that you use around the claim. So for example, if a team stands up and tells me the claim about Russia's gas exports, and they just leave it at that, versus a team that stands up and tells me that the reason why this is true is because of Gazprom, which is Russia's central oil industry. Knowing the word Gazprom doesn't add anything to the argument, right? Like, okay, so you know the name of the Russian like oil company, but what it does do is it gives the judge a little bit of faith that this person understands the topic. They've thought about the topic more deeply. They have some background familiarity with it. And those are all the types of things that we use when we're trying to figure out whether someone is telling the truth. Do they understand this topic at a deeper level? And using your knowledge like strategically to build the judge's trust that you also understand deeper things, or the point you really want to make, is something that is quite useful. This is distinct. Sorry, this is distinct from jargon. Because jargon is essentially like the inartful use of it. It's the use of like confusing language or complicated words to try and like trick the judge into believing the assertion you make. For me personally, and I know for a lot of other judges, the overuse of jargon is something that decreases their persuasiveness. It makes it seem like they don't really understand what they're doing. They're trying to throw buzzwords out there without really understanding. What you're trying to do is to demonstrate your understanding, which will then give the judge faith that you have understanding in other things. So don't use jargon, but use specific details where that will build up the judge's trust that you understand what is happening. I have not done much talking in like 5 days, so sorry. Next, conviction. This is a tricky one. Because we are human beings, people's emotional investment into ideas and their willingness to stand by those ideas is something that signals their internal belief in those ideas. Because if someone shouts to the rooftops, "I believe X, Y, and Z," everyone would know they believe that. And if it turned out not to be true, they would lose their credibility, which means in the debate context, we tend to bring across the same biases. When someone is very committed to something, when they build in a lot of emotion, or they build in very high stakes, if we don't do this, it'll have catastrophic consequences. That can often be for us a signal that this person really believes what they're talking about. This is why it's important to use strategic conviction, though, because we exist not just in like the general public square, but in a highly specialized debating context. There's like a little bit too much emotion, right? we all know, like everyone can picture a debater, Daniel in 2016, who would overuse emotion and overuse rhetoric to try and convince judges of facts in a way that actually wasn't particularly compelling. It's the same way as like using lots of jargon, right? This person is being blusterful because they don't really believe what they are saying. So you have to use conviction quite artfully to really link it into something that tugs at the judge's heartstrings in a way that is subtle, not overblown, and doesn't feel manipulative. Then you have reputation, and reputation is like a really complicated topic in debating, and so I won't make too many like normative judgments about how it can and should play out beyond to say that like judges should be making their absolute best efforts to judge what is happening in the debate in front of them. but reputation is also linked to credibility. And this is a theme that I return to again and again. The trust that a judge has in the speaker, that what they are telling them is the truth, that they're not lying to them, that they're making an accurate statement. This applies both in the immediate and in the long term. The long term being like, this is a trustworthy person, they're well regarded within the debating community. Surely they wouldn't lie to me. Luckily, we know that most good debaters stretch the truth, so hopefully that doesn't play too big a role. But it also takes place in the immediate term, because if you lie obviously early in your speech and you get caught out lying obviously early in your speech, do you think that makes the judge more or less likely to believe you when you then make another factual statement later in your speech? It makes them less likely to believe you because you've betrayed that trust, because you've said something that's patently untrue and you've been exposed by the other team. And that has decreased the judge's trust in what you're saying. And the reputation can play out both in terms of trustworthiness and just generally in skill, because we tend to trust people who do skilled things. So someone is making their points in a really like effectively structured way and communicating, hey, I'm familiar with debating, I'm good, I know what I'm doing, I'm good at debating. That means we're more likely to trust them rightly or wrongly, because it means that you also make assumptions about their reading, their worldliness, the permission you have to believe them. And this can often be very unfair, which is one of the reasons why judges need to be good. Judges need to have conviction to say, is this a good argument, or is this an argument being presented by someone I think is good, and to call out their internal biases about whether someone is good. But in the immediate term, it's not something we should dismiss. If a team has lied to you in their speech or tried to convince you of something that was manipulative and it's being called out, that probably should decrease your plausibility, because making statements that are really, really untrue means that it is likely that the person is willing to make those untrue statements again to you. And that's why it's actually, and this is potentially something that might be lost in some ways of modern debating. It's important not to make claims that are really wrong or that undermine your credibility, because sometimes teams just get up and say a million things hoping one sticks. That'll undermine your credibility unless you have faith in what you're saying. So try and guard quite jealously the value of the things you're saying, giving them as much, only making statements really that you can give as much strength as possible, and making the weighing or the trade-off between, if this is exposed, I'll lose credibility in the eyes of the judge, versus this is a fact that might be helpful for me in the debate. You need to be a bit discerning about that. Last thing is style and storytelling. Speakers that are funny and warm or are passionate and convincing tend to be believed more on their factual assertions. And that's actually, I think, where style really comes in. You're just much more willing to believe someone who makes you feel like they should be believed because of the way that they're speaking, because of the way, the warmth they are making you feel towards them and their team. Equally, if someone is giving you a narrative and a story, our brain connects with those narratives and stories. So if someone goes into detail about the way in which the semiconductor industry in Taiwan evolved, I'm much more likely to believe that than merely someone making a claim about what the semiconductor industry is. Even if nothing has really been added in terms of its actual truth value, we as human beings kind of have an intuitive bias towards saying something that is a well-told story is something that is convincing, because to construct a story has certain costs, the way in the effort you have to put in to think about something and convey it in a way that then locks into that narrative part of the brain. But equally, it's just much more believable when you give me a cohesive narrative that all seems to link together. It's like its own mini factual matrix, except instead of just like brute facts, it's stories that kind of seduce you with their internal consistency in terms of believing that it was true. So, lot to process has just been thrown at you, but essentially, what I want to impress on you just from this is that debating is a trust game. It is about building credibility with the judge so that when you make the risky factual assertion, the 50-50 call, you don't really know it's true, but the other team doesn't really know if it's true because, you know, none of us are experts in the Russian gas industry, which we're all trying to be in this debate. The judge will side with you rather than them. And there's a lot of different techniques that people use to try and bring those things across the line. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free at this moment to send them through private message or just to the chat in general, and I can bring some order. I'll give people a moment. Mosquito. Okay, we've had one burning question about factual assertions and one burning questions about whether I'll share the slides after the workshop. Yes, yeah, we'll share the slides. The question is, how do we connect factual assertions with one another? And the way in which you do that is by building that matrix where the way you structure your point. So when you have a point, you make the claim, this is the outcome, right? I care about XYZ outcome. I care about, for example, whether Russia will change its behavior. And then you'll have basically a pathway to achieving that, where you explain, and the reason why X outcome that I care about will happen is these mechanisms. And the mechanisms will be like, when you introduce blah, blah, blah pressure on blah, blah, blah actor, they'll change their behavior, X, Y, Z. The way in which you then connect factual assertions with each other is within like the sub parts of those points, which is basically just saying each step of that chain, what does actor X look like? You'll have your mini goal for that point. I want to convince them that this actor is malleable, that if you put pressure on them, they'll change rather than become bedded in. And you take that point and then you build facts into it. You say, and the reason why they're malleable is because X fact, X fact, X fact, X fact. And if you've got a bigger fact that kind of relies on everything, you then put facts behind it. Why you should believe this is because of this, 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 and this. So what I mean by factual assertions connecting is you're building this web of facts, which often come very, very quickly within a debate, to go from the stuff that you know the judge will believe towards the stuff that you want them to take more of a chance to believe. Next question, how should judges approach lies? This is very, very quick. You as a judge know what the average reasonable voter or informed global citizen knows, and then assesses things within the context of the debates. So if you believe it is a lie based on your spec knowledge, you kind of have to dismiss that, unfortunately, because firstly, it's probably not a lie. If someone says something untrue in debates, maybe I've been too flippant with the term lie. When people say untrue things in debate, most of the time they're saying something untrue is because they think it's probably true and they're taking a chance. Like, we're taking so many chances in debates. Like we don't know that much. We are very finite boxes of things we actually truly know, and then the rest of the time we're making educated guesses. So never tell a team you didn't buy it because it was a lie. Explain to the teams how it was presented. This is what I think the informed global citizen would believe about it. They think it's probably not true because XYZ reasons, and then talk about what the teams did to try and bolster it. But then the other team told me all these other things, and I was willing to believe those, and yeah, that made it more likely, so I was willing to buy it in the debate. So you never deal on things really on the level of intention. You deal with them on the level of credibility. When this team was exposed on this underlying point, it made me less willing to believe the other claims that they had made, which would then tilted the edge on other factual assertions. Some of these questions get to what I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So if I don't answer your question, just know I'm gonna come back to it. If you don't really know the background to an event, that's fine. This is debating. You're not assumed to know everything. You're assumed to be guessing most of the time. The best debaters in the world are constantly guessing about hundreds of things because they're making really complicated arguments that go well beyond their ability to understand things. But the other team is there to call them out when they get things incorrect, right? So it's really not the end of the world to make a claim. So pick the level of specificity that is effective for you. It's not about honesty per se, but noting sometimes if you make a really brazen lie and it gets exposed as like a lie and it's like quite like sneaky and like just like obviously dishonest. That's something that tanks your credibility. But try and pick the level of specificity that is appropriate and what you think you can defend. How do you make sure you provide just enough facts? Sorry, there's no easy answer to that. Do lots of debating. You get the feel for it. How to improve at storytelling? That's a great question. Watch really good debates and watch debates specifically from people who are really good storytellers. I think there's a lot of modern debaters who are excellent storytellers. Like when I grew up, it was really like the Australian golden age of debating. So if I could tell you like one person to go and watch for telling effective stories, it's Imogen Harper from the University of Sydney, who was world's finalist XYZ. She told just like really excellent like human scale explanation of analysis, and so literally just like watch really good debaters. And if debaters are doing things that aren't like, that don't stir you, that don't connect with you on a human level, that are just like speed reading out of bajillion arguments without explaining to them or bringing them down to the human level, maybe give yourself a little bit of pause as to who you want your like debating like role models to be in how you then construct your own style going forward. Because I can tell you, it makes a huge difference to have someone be able to communicate in like a really person-to-person way instead of a highly specialized, technical, jargonized way. So there's a question of, do judges usually value a great delivery with lies over a subpar delivery filled with facts? And I'll just stop that question at the outset, because to a judge, there isn't really a difference between lies and facts, right? Because that's reliant on stuff that is outside of the judge's knowledge. Most of the time as a judge, you don't know whether something is a lie. And if you do notice a lie because of highly specialized reasons, like because I have a law degree, I'll know more things are lies than the informed global voter, I probably shouldn't credit that specifically. But those are but it's more than if the thing is a truth. It's how believable is this to the informed global voter in the context of the debate. It's that background principle that means that the great delivery is really important to how they believe the facts. But if facts are just more believable than other facts, which may or may not be lies, and of course some things are super believable even though they are lies, right? A lot of people believe things that just like patently aren't true all the time. It might require less good delivery in order to pull the judge across the line. So that's a really good question, because there's two things operating. It's how willing is the judge to believe this just on its base, and like something like the sky is blue, the judge is going to accept that without much done. But the delivery also then makes a difference in when you're comparing facts from that background of how willing the judge is to believe it. Neat. We're going to go into the second half of the seminar, and that's just looking at how do we then respond to these really great lies? So the team has done all of these excellent things that we're talking about. I'm sorry, I shouldn't use the word lie. They've made these factual assertions that are really bad for your case, and you kind of want to like knock them down. What should you be doing in order to try and unpick that when you get into a rebuttal sense? Okay, first things first, slow down. Debating is a game about trust. If you are rushing, if you look like you don't understand what you're doing, you're throwing things at the point, trying to see which of them will stick, that's not going to convince the judge that what you're saying is truthful. It's not going to convince the judge that you really understand it. What you want to do is actually speak as transparently as possible. You want to show the judge that you understand and show the judge that you have nothing to hide. So you're like, yes, they have said this point. They have made this assertion. I'm not going to be desperate. I'm not going to scrabble against it. I'm just going to calmly explain to you why it's wrong. And you should believe me because I seem like I'm in control. I understand the point. I've explained to you. I've showed you that I understand the point. And then here's what I think happens instead. And one of the reasons why it's so important to speak transparently, it's actually kind of important to speak generously about the other team's points, is that you can't rebut a point that you're mischaracterizing. Judges are really smart. They know you're going to try and like sneakily reframe the other people's points into points that are actually worse. But the problem is they listen to their speeches and they listen to your speeches. So they're not just going off what you say in your speeches to how they think about the point. They're really going off what they say. And so if you generously and transparently explain, this is actually what they said, the judge looks at their notes and is like, yes, that is accurately what they said. And then you go through it neatly and are able to identify the things that are wrong with it, that just builds your trust with the judge immensely, because you haven't made the lazy lie. And if you lie to a judge about something that is literally on their paper in front of, that's like an instant loss in credibility. It's one of the silliest things you can do, because it's so easily caught out by the judge. No judge is going to fall for that. You want to be honest with the judge. This is what they said, and then respond to it in a way that allows the judge to really think about what you're saying. You don't have anything to hide. And if they're speaking really fast, if they're not speaking transparently, if they're hoping the judge doesn't spend enough time actually thinking about what they're saying to parse whether it is true, those are things that you yourself can weaponize. You can ask, like, judge, they said this in 4 seconds, hoping you wouldn't really think about it, but let's think about it for a second. Does this claim stand up to scrutiny? And if you just give that judge a little bit of ability to think through it themselves, rather than constantly bouncing from idea to idea to idea, they're more likely to find you compelling and understandable. Second thing you do, construct your own alternative truth. And what I mean by that is it goes to that very first thing of what makes a fact believable, there being no counter explanation. There being no, here's what actually happens, or even just no disagreement within the debate. I kind of think there's a fine line between rebuttal and substantive, because at the end of the day, you're really just trying to convince the judge that one thing is true and one thing isn't true. So always have your alternative truth. If you say something is not true, make sure you say, and this is what is actually true. That is the biggest step you can make in your debating towards actually undercutting another's argument. If you give judge something else that they can say, well, this is the thing that is true, rather than this being the thing that is true. And it's important here that you go beyond just the counter assertion. And I'll be really open here. This is something that New Zealand debating particularly struggles with. We have a bit of a culture of the counter assertion, where you hear even good debaters rebutting and being like, no, this thing isn't true. This is the thing that is true. And this is the thing that is true for these reasons, without actually really thinking through the comparison between those two things and be like, which of the ones, judge, should you believe? They just say, this thing isn't true, this is the thing that is true, without doing that underpinning work. Then ask yourself, well, they've made this factual claim. I believe there's like a 40% chance the judge just believes it in general, because it kind of sounds true. It's like that claim I made about Nord Stream 2. It could be true. I don't really know if it's true. Ask yourself, what have they done well? This, I think, is a question that you should be using all the time when you're thinking about debating. What is the other team doing well? How is the other team winning this debate? What are the effective things that they have done? Because only when you understand what the other team is doing can you start being able to unpick it. And if we go back then to the last to the last slide, and we look at these different things, you'll want to identify what they're doing. Have they built a factual matrix? How specific have they been? Have they dropped in particular details? Have they been particularly emotive, or have they relied on the fact that they have been right about some things to try and leverage it off to make that right about another thing? Or have they told you a story that you just find really compelling for human reasons? Because, humans love stories. It's the reason why we spend so much time reading and watching Netflix. Go through those ideas, figure out what they're doing well, and then find specific ways to counter them. If there's a solid factual matrix, find ways to loosen those facts to say, well, actually one fact doesn't lead to another fact, or that underlying fact is untrue. If they've chosen an awkward level of specificity, try and be a little bit more specific, or be a little bit less specific, and call out the fact that they're using artificial specificity. I love when people give me like a statistic or a number in debate, because I have no grasp of numbers. I could, if I ever use a number in debating, I have almost certainly made it up, because I can't remember numbers. And that's okay, because this is debating. We're not expected to really remember the numbers. And if someone uses a number, point that out. Be like, they want you to believe that 48, specifically 48% of gas of Russia's oil flows through Russia's natural gas flows through Nord Stream 2, and then use that to leverage it. Well, actually, a way more reasonable way to think about it is it's a new project. It's really small. This is the amount we think is projected to flow through, 1/3 or lower amount. adopt their knowledge. So if they start using the word Gazprom, and you're like, oh my God, now I remember the name of the Russian state energy company, start using it so that you can try and edge in onto their turf and seem just as knowledgeable about those issues that they are, but being careful, because remember, if you misuse something, then that decreases your credibility with the judge. If they're being overly emotive or building up the stakes, you can kind of deflate them a little bit. Like I personally love standing up after an overly dramatic speaker and kind of like popping the bubble that they've built around themselves and be like judge. If we think about this without the shouting, a more reasonable way to think about this is X, Y, Z. And you'll have a lot of hyper overconfident debaters who will try and shout their way into being believable. And if you just like note that and address that, it loses some of its power. All of these techniques are things that lose their power when you point them out to the judge. And when you have storytelling, make it clear how it's a nice story, but it doesn't actually match the reality. You can supply your own story, or you can supply your own facts, but at the end of it, the way in which you deal with all of these techniques is by telling your own effective stories, about adopting your own techniques to build up your factual assertions, because what you have here is the clash between factual assertions. It's not a clash between the truth and a lie. It's not even a clash between arguments. It's a clash between who should the judge believe, and you'll be using these techniques as much as other teams will be using them. So draw attention to the judge's tricks. Don't pretend to be confused. This is actually quite an important one that some people I think are mistaught on. And you'll notice it a lot. Like you'll see teams stand up and be like, I was so confused. I had no idea what they were trying to do at this point. In debating, we actually reward knowledge and understanding. And at least to me, it is more effective if you very specifically be like, they made this big, unbelievable claim, and the only support they gave for this claim was a nice story. What I'm going to do for you is build in these facts. And what I've done there is I haven't been confused at all. I know exactly what they're doing. The judge knows exactly what we're doing. We're all in on this joke, and they are unfortunately the subject of that joke. And the joke was the analysis they brought. And so then you can build in your own factual assertions without pretending to be confused. You want to seem like you're in control and that you're the one who should be trusted within this debate. Remember not to be overconfident. Explain what happens if a fact were true. So often someone will claim really overblown consequences or logical leaps from if they are to prove a particular fact. And then in their leader's reply, will stand up and be like, and because we proved this fact, we have won this debate. This debate was all about whether this fact happened. Don't get too focused on the one specific fact. Remember that the rest of the debate is happening around it. And lastly, remember that there's a cost to denying a fact. Debating is all about credibility. It's all about trust. And if you rebut everything, even stuff that is incredibly obvious and the judge is like just obviously not going to agree with you on, you lose a little bit of credibility in their eye. If you start running a whole bunch of material about how the sky isn't blue and that the opposition are lying to you because the sky is like yellow or something, they'll ignore you, and it will seem like you're not the team who is the reasonable one, who has the grasp on those facts. It's better to identify where in the chain that argument is vulnerable. And if it's not vulnerable at the factual level, agree with the facts. Just be like, yeah, the sky is generally blue. It doesn't follow that we should sanction Iran. Like you need to be a little bit discerning with how those facts operate. Okay, layering. So often in debating, you'll just have so many facts that you're dealing with, right? People are throwing fact, especially with like quite quick modern debating, people are throwing a lot of facts at you. The first thing to note is that if someone is speaking so quickly and has so much material, and it's so difficult to find the different parts of the point, that in and of itself is bad debating on their side. And you should make that clear to the judge. Like I actually think I've talked a lot about the things I like in debating. I really like debating, and there's a lot of wonderful things in debating. But one of the most enjoyable things to do in debating is if someone has spent a huge amount of time just kind of like haranguing the judge, point after point after point after point after point. If you can get up and really simply explain to the judge what they've done, and then explain that there's actually only two tiny little things that you need to do to knock out a whole bunch of their material, that is a glorious feeling. Don't lose that. Debating is one on efficiency. It's not one on who can say the most words. Layering flows from that. And so if someone's spoken too fast, like identify that and then do the best that you can within the mess of the points that they've constructed, and hope the judge realizes that the way that they're debating, that they have debated is unpersuasive, and point out the fact that maybe the reason why they gave you the points in such quick fire fashion, or didn't give you enough time to think about the facts that they were bringing, is that they themselves don't really want you to think about those facts too closely or for too long, otherwise they crumble under the pressure. The way in which you need to effectively layer stems from how you approach their material. It actually doesn't stem from how you structure your material. The first thing you should do when figuring out how to respond to something is identifying the parts of their points and describing it as accurately and generously to yourself and maybe to the judge as you can. And points tend to have like a really basic structure. They have premise, conclusion. If you believe X and you believe X, then this is the outcome. Sometimes it's a little bit more complex than that. So you have context. If you believe this, then the mechanism will play out these like sub facts that go into them, which will lead to an outcome, and that outcome is relevant for X, Y, Z reasons. When you're just layering your points, think about the chain and then think about where the weak parts in the chain are. So if they've presented an argument that is reliant on the context being true, and if the context is true, the mechanism and outcome are actually like really easy for you to see. Like, yeah, if that's true, that will happen. Just identify that to the judge. Be like, these mechanism and then this outcome are predicated on this point of context that they've delivered to you. What I'm going to explain to you is why that context doesn't follow, and then why the mechanism and outcome doesn't follow. So you see, only if I understand the chain of their point, this context, this mechanism, this outcome, can I understand how to figure out which bit of it to attack, take it out, and then explain to the judge then how the point falls apart. And in pulling those Jenga tiles out of the tower of an opposition's point is probably the bit of like instinct that sets really good debaters apart, because they can just do it really efficiently. Sometimes, of course, there's no obviously weak link, and you just want to respond to all of them. You're like, each of them are about 50-50. So I'm going to explain why the context isn't quite right. I'm going to explain why the mechanism isn't quite right. I'm going to explain why the outcome is slightly overblown, and then I'm going to explain why it's slightly irrelevant. And sometimes you will have quite like complicated, like layered analysis, but the layer follows the chain that they have built, or the chain that they want the judge to follow. And it's your job to try and pull that chain apart. Remember, don't just rebut the underpinning facts. If there is a fact that is definitely true, you can just ignore it. If someone has said a fact to try and support a later fact, but that doesn't really follow, it doesn't really matter. So say, for example, a team is trying to build a factual matrix, and they say, there's a lot of methanol in the sky, there's a lot of methane in the sky, and methane is blue, and that's why the sky is blue. I can prove to you that there's not a lot of methane in the sky, and I can prove to you that methane isn't blue, but that doesn't change the underlying, like whether the judge is likely to believe the underlying outcome. So just actually, you need to operate with like a little bit of discernment. If facts don't actually support an outcome, you don't need to rebut them. You should ignore them. You should be like they're lying to you about methane, but that doesn't matter, because yes, the sky is blue. What's more important is the fact that the sky being blue doesn't mean we should actually run. So follow through the logic. Sometimes they will construct points in ways that have inconsistencies that don't really make sense. And it's your job to kind of like figure out how the point works, or how the point would work if they had made it well, because remember, their later speakers will always be trying to fix it, and then identify ways that you can get in the way. And note, remember, with 50 minutes prep, every debater in the world is giving rebuttable points. Every debater in the world will be saying things that are inefficient and that aren't helpful to their team. And so you understanding when to rebut versus when to just ignore and move on is actually quite important in efficiency, because like it's really fun to dunk on things that are like obviously wrong, but at the point they're obviously wrong and don't really affect the case, it kind of just becomes a distraction, and you just need to move on quickly. Often with POIs, some really good teams will give you a POI that tries to lead you down a rabbit hole to spend 15 minutes explaining to me why methane isn't blue, when in reality they don't need that argument to win the debate, and they'll just spend the rest of their time doing something more efficient. Last thing to note here with the layering is that later speakers, remember that your job isn't just to come at the arguments fresh, it's to explain that what has been said, and then to explain what you're adding or how you're changing things within the debate. So as a third speaker, you probably have the best version of the layer of an argument. You feel like, these are my points of clash. And this point of clash, they want to prove this outcome, and to prove this outcome, they have this context and this mechanism. You'll say, my first speaker gave you this really important point here, which knocked out their context. What I'm going to add is this, and I'm also going to question the mechanism X, Y, Z, X, Y, Z, X, Y, Z, which means instead of this happening, this will happen. Always have your alternative. Always fill that gap. Explain what you think is going to be the thing that occurs. It has become a beautiful evening here in Auckland. Last thing before we just have open questions is exercises. So there's a lot of exercises you can do to build up your rebuttal strength, but there are 3 types of exercises that I think are particularly helpful. The first is chain identification or trick identification. And this is just building your perceptive ability in debating and the ability to do it really quickly. And when you've done debating for a very long time, like I'll just hear points and intuitively be able to understand the context, mechanism, and impact, even when it's not a very good speaker who's maybe like structured it in a weird way. And I'll like almost by instinct just structure my responses in a way that then responds to the correct structuring of that argument. That's something that you can only really do if you spend a lot of time debating, if you expose yourself to those chains of logic and those tricks as much as possible. So I encourage you to judge. Watch debates. Judge your friends doing debates, take lots of notes. If you go watch out rounds of a major, say you go to Worlds or you go to Australs, like no one's going to judge you for bringing out a pen and paper and taking some notes. See how good debaters are structuring their arguments, and then think about how that logic flows. If you take out one part of the argument, say you take out the context, does the point still work? If you take out the mechanism, does the point still work? If you take out one particular type of impacting, how important is the point still? And if you're engaging in this type of thinking constantly, you'll build those instincts that allow you to very quickly, in the heat of a debate, see what the opposition is trying to do with a point, lay it out in front of you, be able to explain it to the judge, and then be able to start inserting sand into the gears of that point to make sure it breaks down. The next type of arguments are layering and precision. And this is like building up just like not your perceptiveness, but your ability to then do something with that perception really quickly. An example, exercise that I like to do is to say play a point or have a team make a point for you, or listen to an old debate at a point, identify the section by sections, and then go through the layered responses. Be like, in 30 seconds, just demolish that point. Give it all the like structured rebuttal that you can. Be like, it had this context, this mechanism, this outcome. So I'm going to explain to you why there isn't this context, explain to you why there isn't this mechanism, explain to you why there isn't that outcome in like layers. But then you do it again in a slightly shorter amount of time, and then in a slightly shorter amount of time. So you do it in 30 seconds, and you do it in 20 seconds, and you do it in 10 seconds. And that'll force you to really identify what are the key links in the opposition's argument. How can I slice it out in a way that allows me to get through what I think are the most important responses? And the more you do that, the more you just become good at prioritizing your time, and the more precise you get in being able to dismantle points. And the last is building your mental capacity. And by this, I just mean you have to exercise the brain. So do no notes speeches, do no notes like responsive sections, like I was just explaining with the decreasing time increments, but do it in a way that follows the structure. And this will just allow you to hold lots of ideas in your head at the same time and address them in a structured way. Because in reality, especially with rebuttal, you don't have enough time to write everything. So if you intuitively can remember how their point was structured and remember the ways in which you'll address those points, which at the high end debate, you have to, there's just so much material within a debate, you'll be able to do it much more effectively within the debate if you just like force yourself to speak without crutches. So I give a lot of like when I was competing, I used to give a lot of notes, a lot of speeches without any notes, or do debates where I had 5 minutes of prep, and that type of thing just builds your mental capacity. Excellent. That is the end of the formal presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm going to drink a little bit more water, and feel free to send through questions to the chat. I've had a few questions. Sorry, the good debater from Sydney I mentioned was Imogen Harper. She was just really, really good when I was a younger debater. I think she tells very effective stories. Who are other debaters who I think are really good at this? I love how Miko debates. I'm a huge, huge Miko fan. So yeah, watching how they debate is good. There's so many good debaters though. I think rather than identifying specific debaters and be like, copy their style, just give yourself a wide range of people to listen to, figure out the types of styles that work for you in terms of storytelling and being compelling. And also don't just trust that what's popular or what's like the it debater or the it speaker is going to be the dominant style going forward. You want to cultivate your own sense of, well, this is something that really speaks to me, because if you're able to then build your style in a way that then fits with your brain, you will be able to use that much more fluidly than if you're just copying someone because you saw them at like a local mini being successful. Yeah, how can I expound? Can I expound more on the identifying the line of thought from the opposing side? Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is that they give you so many clues as to what they want from their point. And so they'll say, I want this outcome from the point, and that'll normally be their point structure. Why this will force Russia to change their behavior. A lot of the time, you're just kind of listening to like the point structure. So they're making sub points. You won't listen to everything you say, but you kind of glimpse it. And as they go through the point, it'll just become obvious that they want you to believe this thing from this thing, this thing. A little bit of it is instinct. So it's kind of like, if I wanted to prove that outcome, how would I try and prove that outcome? And if you have that in the back of your mind, then you can say, well, I need to prove this thing. If they can't prove this thing, then the point won't flow. And then I structure my thoughts along that. But really, the only way you can do it is by judging a lot of debating, understanding how points work really intimately so that you don't need to be listening too closely in order to do it. And then do a lot of debating. So spend a lot of time in that really precarious liminal space between, oh, I have to listen to them, but oh, I need to write my own speech, which is just like the most like exquisite pressure, right? It's one of the coolest things about debating, and most uncomfortable things about debating is that we're forced to both listen to someone else speaking while having to prepare our own thoughts, and that's terrifying. But the more time you spend doing it, the more comfortable you get doing it, and the more able you are to just rely on your partner. If you're writing something important, being like, please listen, I know they're going to say something important, I'm going to need you to tell me 3 responses in a second. If you watch good teams rather than just good speakers, you'll see they it's not that they talk more than other teams, but they talk really strategically. You'll see them directing each other, normally by the direction of the speaker who's going next. So they'll be writing furiously, and then they'll tap their teammate on the speaker, they'll say something really short, and then they'll go back to writing and speaking. And then you'll see them wait another few seconds, and then they'll turn back, and that person will say something, then they'll go back to their notes. What you're seeing there, obviously you can't hear anything, is a highly specific set of instructions that the person who's speaking next has given to the other person, who's an extra pair of ears for them, that they want them to think about or they want them to listen, and then give it back to them in a really short, condensed, rapid-fire way that can then put into their speech. Yeah, it's really fun. Developing that type of relationship is good with a partner, but note, it isn't actually about the dynamic. I've spoken with a huge amount of different people throughout my career. It isn't actually about the person you're speaking with necessarily, or some like superhuman bond. It's training yourself to be a good teammate, to have that like good teammate habits that'll then allow you to shift fluidly between teams. Is there a way to become more efficient with material and engagement? Yeah, I only started speaking third in my last year of speaking 3v3 because I really struggled to prioritize. And I think really I just had to wait for my brain to catch up a bit. And that just took me a little bit more time to be able to then slice and dice. I think doing the exercises that just build your efficiency, stuff like no notes speeches, stuff like the time minimizing argument, helps you identify really clearly, this is the thing I need to do within this point, and that will then start just giving you more comfort that you can leave other things out of your speech. Other than that, just being disciplined. Like, I went through much of my career being like horrifically undisciplined. It's okay. It just takes time to develop that. Like, focus on, this is the idea that I need to be hammering. These are the ideas that can fall to the wayside. Yeah, just practice. This is why it's one of the most basic questions in debating. I'm sorry, there's no easy answer. How to deal with your opponents if they provide a huge amount of layers? If they provide so many layers, they are lying. I mean that like a little bit jokingly. But if someone is just doing layer, like, why do their points need so many layers? We're talking person to person here about how the world works. If they need to build so many layers into their argument, they're probably hiding something. Is my like suspicious take. The way you deal with it is by understanding what they are doing. They're providing lots of layers. Understanding why they're doing what they're doing. Is it like a technique to hide certain key claims that they're making that are actually really weak? In which case you say, Judge, they've provided you a lot of layers. And the reason they've provided you a lot of layers is because they want to avoid you thinking about two things, thing one and thing two. So I'm going to explain thing one and thing two. And if you believe me on those 2 points, everything else they say is relevant. It falls down. You can't be convinced of the point. So if they're adding layers for no reason, you can slice through those layers. You can be really efficient. And hopefully you have a good judge who doesn't just credit someone for giving lots and lots of layers of arguments, but will credit your discernment in being able to separate out those layers into something that is appropriate. Unfortunately, you might face an excellent debater who is not just giving layers for the hell of it, but is giving layers because they're running incredibly complex, excellent arguments. In which case, the way you deal with that is running your own incredibly complex, excellent arguments and responses. Once again, no easy answer, but ask yourself, why are they providing these layers? Is it adding strength to their arguments, or is it hiding weaknesses that I can point out to the judge and then take advantage of the fact that they've been really inefficient? Neat. Those are all of the questions that I have in my in the chat. Does anyone have any final questions? I'll give you a minute to do so. Yes, you can have the slides. I will send them to Debating Forum. So the name of the speaker I mentioned, like, she honestly does not need any more fame in debating. She's made multiple world finals. I'll just write it in the chat. Imogen Harper, I'm your biggest fan. Yeah, just really good debater. More people should watch her speeches. Do geographical differences play any role? Yes. Different people have different things they find persuasive. I think New Zealand judges find strength of case really persuasive, so they probably bring a bit more into the debate than other judges who are really non-interventionist. And so even if a point isn't brilliantly well made, if they think the case is really strong, they'll be more willing to believe those just like fundamental claims. Whereas other people will have slightly different ways of formulating their humor, slightly different tolerances for fast debating, slightly different jargon that is not too much for them, but that is too much for others. So geographical differences do make a difference. Do debating across boundaries, but note your circuit's debating style is quite special. If other people are unfairly treating it, if you're doing things that are like basic and understood, like you're speaking in a way that is understandable, but they're pinging you for not using the correct jargon, that's something they should reflect in their judge feedback. They shouldn't be treating you like that. Nonetheless, if your style itself is doing things that are not great, and as I point out, that some things in the New Zealand style are not like spectacular. We need to be more efficient in the way, more thorough in the way that we actually deal with arguments that we don't think are strong in the New Zealand circuit, because we're too easy to dismiss them because we think the judges will dismiss them as well. And that's often not the case, and it's one of the reasons why we'll lose debates. You just need to talk about that as a circuit and be like, hey, are we being too reliant on hyper-fast debating or jargonized debating or counter assertions or style? Are we just telling nice stories when we don't know enough about the world? Like start identifying the things that are working well and not working well in your national style, and start those conversations. But you are deserving of respect. All styles have things that are like unique and really cool about them. So try to cultivate that. Try and build off the good. How efficient are POIs for calling out sneaky engagement? No, I think they're excellent because what they do is they ask the speaker, can you go just one step behind that? And sometimes they can't. So say, for example, someone has given like a 15-minute point on, sorry, not 15 minutes, God, that'd be way too long, like 30-second, you see, very bad with numbers. Most of the time when I say a number, I'm just really hoping it's accurate for context. If someone has given spent a minute on a point and it's all reliant on one little thing, and you just call them back to that POI being like, hey, all of this analysis that you've presented is contingent on you proving this one bit of context that you've spent barely 5 seconds on. Can you give us any other reason why we should believe that underlying assumption? That forces them to backtrack. And it's oftentimes the reason why they've only spent 5 seconds on it is because they don't have the next 10 seconds of explanation. And so if you give that POI, it draws the judge's attention to it, you start pinning them back on it, and then you can do that good work of then following it up. It is frankly all of those. Different. So the question was which part of a case should prioritize in untying a good lie? Is it the root, the analysis, the conclusion, the impacts? People can be making exaggerated claims in any number of those facets. It's your job to identify the chain and then break the parts of the chain necessary for them to get their outcome, or the outcome as strongly as they want. So you're never driven by, I need to respond to the root of this, I need to respond to the analysis, I need to respond to the conclusion. You're always just identifying which one's the weak link. There's always a weakest link in a point, which is the one that I need to pull on in order to have any chance of beating that point. Neat. Any final questions? Yep, you've just gotten a link in the chat, which has a link to the YouTube, the Facebook, and the website. Do I need to give a plug for anything? No? Go to Australs. I think Australs is like an incredible tournament. It's probably the tournament that for me I've improved most at. Like 3v3 makes you rigorous in a way that I think sometimes like BP, because it's just shorter time frames, there's not like engagement across like 6 speakers as cleanly. You can kind of get it like a little bit lazy on. So one bit of advice: go to Australs. I have no yeah. Hopefully we're gonna have a really good Australs this year. Vote for Vietnam Worlds. Yeah, debating's really fun. Hope you all enjoy it.